We have electricity, we have steam still, we're still going to use that, and we have steel. What can we do with it? Changes in transportation. This is going to be one of the major areas that's going to change. Before steam engines, boats relied on wind and water currents to move. But what if there's no wind, right? Well, you have to row, and that's not a great job. But you'd have to either sit there and wait for the wind to come back, or you would have to row. Otherwise, you're stuck. And what if you want to go against the current? Well, we talked about this before, way back in ancient history. The Nile, the Yangtze, like all these ancient rivers, they would usually have roads built next to them. The Grand Canal in China, you would have roads built next to them, and the idea was that if you wanted to go the wrong way, you wanted to go against the current, you would throw a rope to the side, and then people, sometimes people, or a team of animals would then haul your ship against the current, and that's got to be back-breaking, grueling labor. So let's change that, right? Now we have all these new technologies, now we can start making steamships and other technologies. So towards the late 19th century, steamships replaced basically all the wooden sailing ships. They're all going to start changing. In the 1860s, American Civil War, there was a famous battle between reformed sailing ship. Was it the Virginia versus the Merrimack, I believe it was. Um, I'm probably getting that wrong. The Monitor versus Merrimack. I think that might be right. Whatever. That was one of the big battles between the changing of the ironclads and the steamships moving into the against the sailing ships. We started to see new change technologies. Basically, that's the gist of it. Um, but steamships start replacing all the old sailing ships. Made sense. Now you have a power source inside of your ship. You don't need wind, you don't need currents, you don't need rowing. Now you just need to have coal, and you can power and make steam, and then you can use that steam to push some kind of propeller, and it will be able to propel your ship against the current, against the winds. Before long, people took the idea of basically taking this concept and putting it on tracks and creating trains, locomotives, and they could go incredibly fast for the time, 30 miles per hour, which seems obviously really slow compared to your car, but way faster than anything most people had any experience with. Uh, there were people saying things like you couldn't breathe at 30 miles an hour and stuff, obviously ridiculous, but 30 miles an hour is pretty fast. Uh, the first trains lost races to horses. Horses could run faster than trains, and that's true. But trains can carry a lot more weight once they get going. They can carry a heavy amount of weight, and they don't need to stop. Horses break legs on uneven terrain. Horses need water. Horses need food. Trains don't. Trains just keep going. As long as you can feed it coal, it will keep chugging along. That's crazy. Because now, and you probably heard of like the railroads we built in the United States of America. It's going to close distances. Now all of Europe can be connected through train tracks. All of America can be connected through train tracks, and it's easier to transport large amounts of people, large amounts of goods, large amounts of anything. This is going to help feed our factories. The new factories making stuff need to get a lot of raw materials. Well, trains are going to feed them. Steel production, locomotives, and steamships kind of go hand in hand in that way. So more steel was required for more trains, and the trains helped build more steel. Ah, next one. All right. So industrial revolutions going gangbusters. England's the first leader, but then Germany and the United States of America quickly follow. France does, but largely after its revolution. So they kind of drag their feet during the end of the feudal period. We talked about the French Revolution already, but after the revolution, they also join on board with this as well too. Germany and the United States of America have vast amount of resources, especially coal and iron. It's just going to give them a huge advantage. America is obviously a massive country. We have a lot of different types of resources. Germany, not as much, but they did have some coal and iron to get them started. Russia is going to I don't do it in the very, very Russian way, I guess. They will have some industry, but not very much. Most Russians, many of the Russians at this time period, the people who had power, were trying to maintain the feudal system. They're trying to maintain the feudal way of life, controlling the traditional way of labor, basically having lords who would control people's lives and own the land. And Russian lords, their wealth was tied up in land and human ownership in that way. Remember, serfs aren't slaves, but they basically are. So they were trying to hold on to this system. There will be some factories, there will be some train tracks, but very few compared to a lot of the rest of Western Europe and the United States of America. So Russia is sort of industrializing, but also sort of not. They're kind of failing. Some of the first Russian railroads, too, they used you got to think about it too. Like when we're building train tracks and building trains, there were no standards at first. So the Russians started building their own train tracks and railroads using different sizes, different gauges that weren't compatible with what the Germans and Western Europeans were using. So you'd have to get things off of a train, put it on a different train if you wanted to trade with France or something. That's ridiculous. So Russia's halfway into industrialization, halfway out. They're still holding on to the feudalistic system. They have not had a revolution yet. They're still holding on to the classic way of life, and their industrialization is going to struggle because of it. The rest of the world, so outside of Western Europe, sort of Russia, and the United States of America, no industry at all. China, Japan resisted this outright. The Ottomans resisted it outright. They did not want to see any changes, and so you're not going to see factories developing. You're not going to see new technology developing in these countries. They don't want the change, and they're going to fight it off. They've resisted the change to their traditional way of life, the way their peasants, their lower class people worked. And so they did not want to see any of these changes. So for the most, the European powers are having this giant boom of material living and technological creation. Meanwhile, the traditional powers of the world, China, India, Japan, the Middle East, they're going to start lagging behind. They're going to start falling behind because they are holding on to the traditional ways and resisting this new improvement, all these new technologies. They'll oftentimes buy the output of these machines. They'll buy the new guns and the cannons that are mass produced in factories. They'll buy the clothing that's mass produced in factories oftentimes, but they're not going to encourage their own development inside of their own country. And that's going to have a problem later on. Let's talk about the U.S. here a little bit. In the United States of America, we'll talk more about America later on. Mass production starts to become a big thing. Now, it's been around for a while. Adam Smith wrote about mass production in Wealth of Nations. We talked about him before with capitalism and such. But, mass production had been around for a while, and the concept is really, really old. However, Eli Whitney is usually credited with being one of the first people to bring it to America. He gets a patent for creating firearms for the U.S. military. He basically wins a contract and comes out with a way to mass produce using interchangeable parts firearms. How does he do this? Well, the way his plan was is that every part of the gun would be the exact same, which we could do now with factory labor, and every single part would be interchangeable. It's kind of look like IKEA furniture here, but it's the same idea. Everything is interchangeable. So if a part of your gun breaks, you just sub it out with another part. Here's part 38 or whatever. You just slap it in place, and that will be an interchangeable replacement part. So one person's job at the factory would not be to make an entire gun. One person's job would be just make part 37, just make part number 10, and they would work on the machines that would make just those individual parts. They would take that part, hand it over to the next guy, who would then take part 10 and hook it through part 11, and then move it into the next part. And that's all that person would do all day long. 12, 14 hours a day, you would make part 10, somebody else would make part 11, and somebody else would slap them together. This would drive you nuts, probably, and some people are good at this kind of labor. A lot of people, it's hard. It's hard to do this mentally, day in and day out, thousands and hundreds of thousands of times. But this was what jobs became for mass production. Eli Whitney is usually credited with it for his mass production of guns, but then this idea will apply to a wide variety of pretty much everything else. Mass production is going to be how we make everything. Henry Ford, another American inventor, Henry Ford, 1913, uses this assembly line approach, this mass production, interchangeable parts, assembly line approach to mass produce Model T cars, right? And so now the automobile prices plummeted, and all of a sudden everybody can own a car. Much more commonly. So America is going to become an early leader in this time period. We're going to talk more about American research development and the battle between Edison and Tesla and things later on. But as the Industrial Revolution spread, right, America is going to be one of the early leaders. They're going to start taking off with this. It's going to take a little while, but we're getting towards the rise of the New West and the American century, which we'll talk about later on.